which is a part of the Watson Institute. Welcome to the many Brown students, faculty, alumni, and other interested citizens joining us virtually. The Taubman Center seeks to influence American politics and policy through scholarship, public opinion polling, conferences, workshops, academic research, internships, and a robust series of speakers drawn from experts, the media, academia, think tanks, and public officials. The Taubman Center for several years has focused its efforts on three themes: the pursuit of security, the cost of living, and the challenges to our democracy in America. This year, we're placing special emphasis on the national elections and the subsequent consequences as the nation grapples with issues of social justice, public health, education, the economy, and the commitment to the rule of law, with a roster of outstanding speakers and programs. Tonight, we present the ninth in our series of events. We're honored to have as our guest a great American, one of the elder statesmen of the Democratic Party and its nominee for president in 1988, Governor Michael Dukakis. Michael Dukakis was elected governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in 1974. He served 3 terms from 1975 to 1979 and from 1983 to 1991. He is the longest serving governor in Massachusetts history. In 1986, he was voted the most effective governor in the United States by the National Governors Association. The governor got his start in politics as an elected Brookline Town Meeting member. He served in the Massachusetts House of Representatives for 8 years and ran for lieutenant governor in 1970 with former Boston Mayor Kevin White. That election was won by former Republican Governor Francis Sargent. In 1974, Governor Dukakis defeated Sargent to become Massachusetts' 65th governor. He served 1 term before losing to Ed King in the 1978 Democratic primary, but returned to take back the governorship in 1982. He was reelected to a 3rd term in 1986 with a staggering 69% of the vote. In 1988, the governor won the Democratic nomination for president. He was defeated that year by then Vice President George H.W. Bush in what was then considered a bruising campaign. It is interesting to note that one of the candidates the governor defeated for the 1988 Democratic presidential nomination was a senator from Delaware named Joe Biden. Governor Dukakis recently retired from his position as a distinguished professor emeritus of political science at Northeastern University. He also served as a visiting professor at the Luskin School of Public Affairs at UCLA. He and former U.S. Senator Paul Simon authored How to Get into Politics and Why, a book aimed at encouraging young people to think seriously about politics and public service as a career. My conversation tonight with Governor Dukakis will last approximately 30 minutes, and after which we will take questions from the audience. You may enter questions through the Q&A function on Zoom, which will be viewable to me. You may begin entering questions if you have them already, beginning now and throughout the program. Please keep them short and to the point. I'll convey as many of these questions to Governor Dukakis as we have time for. This event is being recorded for later viewing, available on the Taubman Center website or the Watson Institute website. And now it's my great honor to introduce to you former Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis. Welcome to Brown, Governor.
Thanks, Rich. Thanks very much.
It's
a big fan of Browns. 2 of my students went to Brown. two of my kids went to Brown.
Right. That's great. We always like to welcome Brown families back into the fold. Governor, we're now only about 5 days from Election Day. And by yesterday, more than 75 million Americans have already voted. I've called this the most consequential election since the Civil War. In your view, what's at stake?
Just about everything, Rich. I must say that I've never seen anything quite like this. And I've been in politics for a long, long time. I think it mostly has to do with a guy named Trump. And we may or may not want to get into that, but clearly he's a very different cut from anything that we've seen in politics. And it will be interesting to see in a few days whether or not the American people want to buy this stuff or whether they're prepared to return to something a little more normal, maybe considerably more honest, but more focused on the real problems that are facing the country. And we now see what happens when you don't focus on those problems. We're in the middle of an epidemic here, which is getting worse and worse and worse, with an administration in office that doesn't seem to be able to cope with it. So this is a new, different, and very troubling period in American politics. And personally, I hope we can end it in a few days, which, by the way, take place on the 3rd of November, which happens to be my 87th birthday. So I'm looking forward.
Happy birthday in advance.
Happy birthday and a happy election.
Right, that's right. You may have to delay your birthday a little to get the final results.
It may be.
Depending on how this goes.
Yeah.
What do you think the legacy of 4 years of Donald Trump in the White House is? Is this something that we'll be grappling with for a long time, or do you think if he's voted out next Tuesday that things will snap back to more normal quickly?
If he's defeated after a 4-year term, I think we can get back to sense and reality and good government pretty quickly. If he isn't, and we have him for another 4 years, so he's in for 8 years, that's going to have some real consequences. I think American democracy can weather that, but it will be very, very difficult. And for those of us, you're one of them, I'm another, who have not only been in politics and government for a long time, but care deeply about it, what's happening is very troubling.
It's distressing. The polls in this 2020 presidential race have been about as stable as any that I've seen, really any in the history of polling presidential races. And they've been consistently encouraging for Democrats. How confident are you heading into Tuesday?
Not so confident, only because we've been here before.
Yes.
Not so much in 2016, but enough so that one has to be very concerned. There seems to be a consistency here. There seems to be a stability in what we're looking at. But we know from 2016 and from other elections. Look, right. I'm a guy who served as governor for 4 years, was 40 points ahead in the polls going into my party primary, right, with 5 weeks to go, and was defeated. Then had to come back and beat the guy that beat me 4 years later. So I'm a guy who's not skeptical of polls, but you just have to be very careful not to assume that those numbers are going to be real and consistent and unchanging. There has been a consistency, no question, in the polling. In fact, I think the last few days, we've seen some very gradual improvement in Biden's numbers. But Florida, key state, if Biden takes it, the race is over. But what do we got? 2-3 percentage points between these two folks. Now, I don't know what all of my friends in Florida are thinking about these days, but there is something about Trump that does attract support. I mean, he's been consistently in the 43, 44, 45% range.
Very solid base. That's
Seems to be. If it were 20%, I'd say, well, okay. I mean, you know, that's what happens. But this is 45 or 44. And that's concerning.
You mentioned your gubernatorial races. I remember them very well, by the way, particularly the first one in 1974, when, of course, I was with Paul Tsongas up in Lowell at that time. But what I was remembering and wanted to mention to you is I thought you had one in that campaign, had one of the great bumper stickers of all time. It just simply said, Mike Dukakis should be governor.
I'm not sure who came up with that, but I had a few others as well. When I won the nomination, the Democratic nomination for lieutenant governor, and ran with Kevin White, I was relatively unknown. I mean, I'd been a pretty active state legislator. And Steve Kinzer, who is now part of the Brown family, as you know, was my young assistant at the time, and came up with the idea of producing bumper stickers which simply said, Dukakis 70. And Steve was out driving in Western Massachusetts, and in those days they pump your gas for you. And he drove into a gasoline station, and the guy who was pumping his gas said, Dukakis, what's a Dukakis? And Kinzer said, it's a rare bird. There are only 70 of them left. Anyway, and Steve, of course, has gone on to do some great things. Is now doing some teaching and writing at Brown.
Well, going back to the 2020 race on the congressional side, what do you think about the Senate?
I think it's promising, but by no means a done deal for the Democrats. It looks as if what could have been a troubling House race has changed.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure I understand entirely why, but it looks as if at the House level, the Democrats are going to do very well again and probably expand their numbers in the House of Representatives, which is really kind of interesting. Now that should help the fight for the Senate as well. But remember, those are a limited number of seats.
Right.
And a lot of money is getting poured into those races, especially now with the pandemic. So we will see what happens. I think most folks give the Democrats a fair chance of taking control of the Senate, but it's going to be a real fight.
Yeah, it is interestingly two pretty tight races in Georgia.
Isn't that interesting? I should say.
Both of which could wind up in runoff elections.
That's right.
And if that's what winds up determining the majority,
the Senate,
we may be sitting around waiting even after the Senate comes back into session.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, the president has worked full-time hard to undermine voter confidence in mail-in balloting and has called the elections themselves rigged. Of course, he said the same thing in 2016. How concerned are you about that the election will be destabilized in some way, and or that a Biden victory won't lead to a peaceful transfer of power?
I'm concerned. A lot of it depends on whether or not if Biden wins, he wins decisively, and especially in certain key states. If Biden takes Florida, I think that race will be over. But if we have one of these repeats of some of the things we've seen before, who knows when it's going to end? And the one thing we know about Trump is that he's really without shame. I mean, he votes absentee all the time. For some reason, that's different.
Yes.
I don't understand it.
Yeah.
And we have very good evidence that the folks that are responsible for our elections at the local level tend to take their responsibility very seriously, no matter what their party, where they are, geography and otherwise, which I think says a lot for the American system, because it is a highly decentralized system of voter administration. And it's to their credit that they do take that responsibility very seriously. But given what we've seen about Trump, I wouldn't put anything past him. And that's one of the reasons why a decisive victory at the earliest possible time would go a long way toward ending all this speculation about whether or not he's going to steal the election or not going to stay in, not going to leave office if he.
I think you're right. I think that would undermine any traction
Right.
toward delaying things, or dragging it through the courts for an extended period of time. I mean, he even with a substantial victory, he'll likely claim that the election was rigged and it was stolen from him.
Which he did in 2016.
That's right. Even as he won.
Even as he won, but not the popular vote.
Well, that's right.
And I don't think he's gotten over it. You and I are both familiar with New Hampshire. New Hampshire has a very interesting Secretary of State who's been there for a long time and takes his responsibility very, very seriously, to his credit. And he was outraged when Trump started suggesting that folks from Massachusetts were driving up to New Hampshire and voting in the New Hampshire election.
Right.
I mean, impossible, given the guy that runs the elections up there.
Yeah, right.
But he insisted on making that claim. Well, again, they're polls, but the current polls on New Hampshire show Biden substantially ahead of Trump, which I think would be a good thing, if only because it would be impossible for Trump to argue that a 10 or 12% victory on the part of Biden somehow was rigged.
Right.
It was very close, as you know, last time. That's not close. So we'll see what happens. But some decisive victories in key states would go a long way toward ending this speculation.
Well, let's assume for the moment a Democratic White House next year and a Democratic Congress in January. What do you think should be the first items on the agenda?
First one has to be dealing with this public health problem. I mean, this is disgraceful. It's embarrassing. And it's dangerous. And if you've checked the numbers in the last 2 or 3 days, I mean, it's getting very close to being out of control. 70, 80,000 cases a day and no end in sight. So that's got to be the first order of business. If only because we can't get our economy and our society working again unless we get serious about dealing with this problem. And I have no doubt that Joe Biden's top priority is going to be that. If it is done and done effectively, and it's not going to be easy because it's taking off on us, but assuming it's done effectively, I think you'll see the economy in the country coming back, and a huge sigh of relief on the part of an awful lot of Americans if that happens. And then it's a question of going to work, putting together an effective domestic policy. And by the way, getting serious about being responsive to what's going on in the world as a whole, where we've had the damnedest foreign policy, if you want to call that, I've ever seen.
Relating back to your point about the pandemic, one of the ways that the president really failed to take hold of this issue was by dumping it on the governors, and keeping himself in the position to claim credit for a solution or an opening up or rebound to the economy or anything in the positive direction, but leaving the various governors to holding the bag for all of the uncomfortable decisions that had to be made. I'm just wondering, as a longtime governor yourself, how you see this through the kind of the lens of federalism.
Federalism under the circumstances. Look, one of the best things about being governor, as far as I was concerned, was the opportunity it gave one to work with other public officials, governors as well as the president and Congress, in a collaborative way to deal with some of these problems. I learned a lot. I got a lot better at it personally, to tell you the truth. So I began understanding how good people can work together. I mean, Mike DeWine and I, the governor of Ohio, probably disagree on a lot of things, but I have great admiration for DeWine because he is actively attempting to do the job, but is entitled to have a federal state partnership which reinforces what he's trying to do. And the same is true of other governors, Republicans as well as Democrats. But when you have an administration like this one, that first lies about it and then says, well, we're not going to do anything until we can get to the point where we can claim credit for the recovery. That's a very, very tough road to hoe. I mean, I loved the governorship. There's no better job than being governor of Massachusetts, let me tell you. And I think we demonstrated that we could do very good things. But you have to have a federal partner who's on the level. And that's true whether he or she is a Republican or a Democrat. And that has been totally, totally absent under the Trump administration. And it has hurt us very, very badly. And now we're seeing the results of that, Rich, in a dramatic and alarming way, especially this last few weeks.
Yeah, and I think also that there is a need for some consistency state to state, and
collaboration. I mean, one of the things that was so good about being governor was that you could learn from your colleagues. Dan Evans was the Republican governor of Washington, state of Washington, as you know, a wonderful guy. I guess these days we call him a progressive Republican or something. Mm-hmm. I learned more from Dan Evans. In fact, we just had a chance to talk fairly recently. And I said to him, I learned more from you, Evans, than any other person that I worked with. And he was terrific, always willing to help, sharing ideas, opinions, and so forth. He was a Republican, I was a Democrat. Now, we had fundamental agreement on a lot of issues, but I have enormous respect for him. And he was more than willing to be helpful and to share his experience, and there was a lot of experience, with a young guy who was 42 years of age and was trying to dig the state of Massachusetts out of terribly difficult economic situations. And I value that experience and tried to do the same when I could with other governors coming along. And that's one of the great things about being part of this federal system, if it works well. I've never seen anything like what we've been getting from Trump. Doesn't he understand this?
Hmm.
Does he understand that this is a collaborative effort in which good people on both sides are doing their best to make this the very best country we can make it, and to make this world the best world we can make it? That's totally lacking in this administration. It's just extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you have to be. It's so clear that it's not even partisanship to point that out. I mean, it's just
we share experiences. If I was doing something that seemed to be working, I'd share it with my Republican colleagues and vice versa. And there was a wonderful sense of being part of something that was bigger than just ourselves. National Governors Association was a very active organization at that time, and lots of good people. A fellow named Clinton was the chairman of the National Governors Association the year that I ran for the presidency, and we were very close. But it also included Republicans and good ones.
mm-hmm.
And for reasons I don't understand, there seems to be almost none of that these days, Rich, in the Governors Association. It's all about Trump. And in fact, he'll go after Republican governors who don't agree with him on things. Attack them, insult them. I don't understand this. But I had the great good fortune of being able to work with some awfully good Republican as well as Democratic governors and sharing ideas and making things happen.
Well, and not just among the governors. I mean, in many ways, the Congress is suffering from the same disease.
Same thing, yeah.
And it seems to me that it's very difficult for a democracy to continue to survive in the absence of the willingness of the two parties to come to the table and deal with each other.
Collaborate. Yeah. To share ideas, to share their experiences, to share things that seem to be working for some of them, which is important that others know about. I mean, that's one of the very special things about American politics, and it seems to be totally missing.
Let's talk for a minute about the one branch that's not supposed to be quite so political. And of course, that's the judiciary. And, we've just been through this hasty confirmation of Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett. I'm sorry. If the Democrats take control of the White House and the Congress, there's been a lot of talk, even among some members of the Senate Democratic Caucus and so forth, about and the word retaliation gets thrown around, but about increasing the size of the Supreme Court, what we came to call court packing during the Roosevelt administration. I'm wondering, as a longtime good government advocate, how you view that idea.
Well, I'm very concerned about it, even though I think what has happened, and in particular the role that the Senate Majority Leader has played in this, is just outrageous. But we learn, there's an old Greek saying, Mathema, mathema. Things happen, you're supposed to learn from them. And a very, very able, popular, powerful president tried to pack the court because he was facing an entrenched, very conservative majority on the court.
Right.
And he got badly defeated. It hurt him. didn't defeat him electively in an elective sense, but it was not a good time for the Roosevelt administration at a time when he was supposed to be at the height of his popularity in the late 30s. The other thing we do know, have learned over time, Rich, is that justices don't always act the way you think they were going to act.
Yeah.
That's happened to some extent with the current chief, and it's happened many times in the past. So I agree with Biden. Let's take a look at this very seriously. Gorsuch has handed down a couple of decisions in the last several months, which are not conservative decisions. I don't know him that well. I remember his mother was not a very good EPA administrator. I'm not suggesting that the mother and the son are somehow in cahoots.
Yeah, all right.
But I think we got to be very careful about this notion that, well, let's just find 6 liberals and stick them on the court. I mean, change the law, stick them on the court, and everything's going to be okay. A little concerned about that. Got to watch it. Got to proceed pretty cautiously here.
Yeah, and I think it raises the question, if you do that, the Democrats put 4 new justices on the court. What happens the next time the Republicans are in control on Capitol Hill and the White House?
We'll end up with a Supreme Court of 25 people
I
or more.
say, right, by the next century, it'll be the size of the House of Representatives.
Right.
I
say that, even though I think what the Senate Majority Leader has done has just really been disgraceful.
Really outrageous, and
given his activities back when Obama was president, and
I wonder if you'll agree with
very good person.
This plugs back to what we were talking about before in terms of the extreme partisan polarization, and we've seen that. Not only have we seen that infect the courts somewhat, but also, this, what we're talking about here, this kind of action and reaction, tit for tat. It's, it's what drives this process of polarization. My students laugh at me because when I talk about polarization, I crank my arm. I don't know if you can see it on Zoom, but I crank my arm because I see it as a kind of circular process. And, I think, I wonder if you agree, but I think, somebody's got to break the cycle at some point. Otherwise you have, this, you have retaliation, then the other side feels aggrieved and they find the next opportunity to push it even further. And so we've now had a period of, it's about 4 decades now that, this process has been getting worse and worse. Really,
I can tell you what's going to happen. If Roe versus Wade is repealed or reversed, there will be a national network of states that allow abortion that will make it possible for women to get abortions all over the country, even if their own state doesn't allow it. And it's not going to be fun. It's not going to be pleasant. It's going to be divisive, but it's going to happen. Now, don't the folks that are pushing for anti-abortion judges, don't they understand what's going to happen here? Because this is a federal system. And a substantial number of states do have laws that permit abortion. And I don't think that's going to be good for the country, but that's what's going to happen, just as sure as we're talking about it tonight. And further divide the country in ways that I think are unfortunate.
we'll finish this presidential election in 2020 with something on the order of 6.7 billion dollars in spending by the two presidential candidates. And the congressional election adds another $7 billion to that total. That total is double the amount spent just in 2016. And as you know, when you ran in 1988, the total spent on the presidential and congressional races combined was about 1.6 billion. And I'm sure that seemed like a whole lot of money at the time.
It did.
So my question is,
it was.
Yeah, it was. It is, really. I tell my students all the time about how in 1974, in that race up in the 5th district, we raised $100,000, and we thought we were really kind of hot stuff for getting up to that number, And just a couple decades later, Tsongas's widow ran for the same seat in the special election and needed to raise $2.6 million in order to win the same seat. So what I wanted to ask you is, and I think I know the answer to this question, but in order to launch your discussion of it, do you favor campaign finance reform? And if so, how would you do it?
The answer to the first question is yes, I always have. The answer to the second question is, I'm not sure I know these days. Because both court decisions as well as practice have really just blown those limits that most of us strongly favored right out the door. And it may well be, Rich, that you really can't control the amount, but you can encourage very broad participation on the part of relatively small donors.
Right, and we've kind of fallen into that by virtue of technology, right?
That's right. Very interesting. The internet has made a huge difference in the ability of people, candidates, campaigns to raise large sums of money from a very broad base of relatively small contributors. And I'm not sure that's the worst thing in the world.
Yeah.
I mean, it just kind of has evolved, but look at the money that Biden has been able to raise from some wealthy donors, but largely from a very broad base of small contributors, which not only is good in terms of trying to keep big, dark money out of the system, but also gives you an opportunity to involve people actively, not just as contributors, but as participants,
right?
As active campaign workers. And it's happened. I think what we're seeing in this election, this outpouring of active public participation, both financial and political, has really been very impressive. And if in fact Biden wins, I think you will see a very, very broad base of financial support and participation, even with the health issues that we're dealing with here. And you're right, it was the internet of all things that essentially began this process. Who would have thunk it?
Yes.
I don't think had we been talking about this 20 years ago, any one of us would have been able to predict what has happened. And it's dramatically increased the amount of popular participation in campaigns.
And broaden the pool of candidates who were able to participate.
No question.
Who in the past couldn't meet that first threshold as a lesser known candidate. To the first question, as you well know, the first question every candidate gets from the media is how much money have you raised?
Yeah, yeah. But look at what we're seeing here. I mean, that South Carolina race, how much money has
Right.
the Democratic candidate raised? I mean, millions. African American, good person, but I don't think he would have been in the 10 years ago, maybe, would he have been in the game at all in terms of fundraising? I don't think so. I don't think so. So you never know sometimes when good things will happen.
Well, you know, I keep referring back to our old friend Paul Tsongas, but you know, he's an example in some ways because when he ran for president, he won in New Hampshire and then he won in Maryland, but he had no capacity for raising the kind of money that you go on to Florida with all of its media markets. And of course, Clinton just blew him away there. But that kind of circumstance could play out very differently now in this environment with the internet and the ability to raise that kind of money. I was thinking when you cited South Carolina, if you really want to see a gold-plated race, let's have that circumstance that I mentioned before with two seats, with two runoffs in Georgia and the Senate in the balance, and watch how much money pours into that state in that circumstance.
Right. Often from relatively small, a large base of relatively small contributors.
Sure,
right?
absolutely.
Who then get deeply and actively involved in the campaign itself, Rich, organizationally. And that's different.
So we've jointly kind of wrung our hands about the excessive polarization in the political environment. You know, I'm wondering if you have some ideas. I get this question all the time.
Deal this.
What do you do about it?
let me give you my own experience because I think it is instructive. So, I'm this young guy from Brookline, Massachusetts, whose parents were Greek immigrants and remarkable people in many ways, and who at the age of 9 or 10 began getting involved politically. Because I looked around and saw injustice everywhere. African Americans could not live in the town of Brookline, Massachusetts when I was a kid. Couldn't live in the town. We had 3 black families, 2 were janitors, and one was a world-renowned tenor who somehow found somebody on Pill Hill in Brookline to sell him a house. That was it. Anti-Semitism was everywhere. I mean, I could go on and on and on. And there was something about this that just bothered the hell out of me at the age of 9 or 10. And I decided I wanted to do something about it. And with others began organizing and creating a kind of new democratic. In fact, we ran against the existing Democratic organization and beat it in Brookline, of all places. And the rest, as they say, is history. And because of this experience, I'm a huge believer in precinct-based grassroots organizing and getting people involved and getting young people involved. In an interesting kind of way, with all of our problems about what's been going on over the past 3 or 4 years, what we're seeing is a huge increase, and you know this better than anybody, in participation on the part of young people who were pretty absent in 2016 and unquestionably are very, very active in this election. It may, in fact, make the difference. Well, I think that's a good thing.
It's a good thing. Certainly a good thing. I had planned to ask you about this. That you know, for many years, the turnout, you know, in elections for young people has been lowest of all age cohorts. and this puzzling and distressing to many of us. I was going to offer you the opportunity to since we have a lot of young people in our audience, I was going to offer you the opportunity to address them about the need to go out and vote. But I think you're right that this time around, young people are a lot more engaged, and
No question about it.
we're seeing it in the early voting.
Oh, yeah, very much so. Not just engaged, but participating.
Right.
Not just showing up at the polls, but getting into this thing and really trying to make a difference. And they can. There's no question about it. We'll see what happens on Tuesday, but I will be very much surprised if young people and the youth vote, so-called, don't play a major role in this campaign. We'll see. But all indications seem to be that, in fact, they are engaged. And there's very little of this, well, my vote doesn't matter, and same old stuff, and so on and so forth. We're not hearing that these days. And I think that's a good thing.
I agree. Go back to the courts for just a minute. I wanted to ask you, it's been for several decades now that Republicans have very effectively been laser focused on getting the people they want onto the courts, not just the Supreme Court, but in many ways, as you know, the circuit courts are even more important because they decide many times the number of cases that the Supreme Court does.
Most people are surprised, Rich, that when you say to them, how many cases the Supreme Court decides in a given year? About 85. 85. That's all they. What do they do with the rest of their time?
Exactly.
It's the courts of appeal that
right
allow that work.
Right, and Republicans have been focused on that.
Indeed, they have, and Democrats have not been.
They're focused on those courts, and this has been going on for decades now. And we don't see the equivalent laser focus from Democrats, and that's really my question. What's your view? What's that all about?
It's about Democrats not paying attention.
Right.
Things were happening all around them, but they're going to pay attention now, and it's going to take time, and we don't know what the results are going to be on Tuesday. But I would be astonished if you don't see an outpouring of Democratic activism when it comes to dealing with the courts and the judicial system generally. And by the way, it's not just the courts, but the politicization of the Justice Department, which has had a very impressive reputation for playing it straight and for taking their responsibility as the Justice Department very seriously. You think you're going to see that as well?
Well, that's a pretty good transition into my next question, which is about one of the things that the Trump years have laid bare is an array of problems about ethics. I mean, some, we've touched on that specific to Trump himself, but in the process, we've been forced to look at things like nepotism in the White House, conflicts of interest, the failure to reveal income taxes, just to name a few of them. But many of them are, in fact, loopholes or holes left in the network of laws that we have about these ethics, mostly because it never occurred to, I think it never occurred to anyone that we have a president of the United States who would violate so blatantly violate these mores.
couple of comments on that. First, let's not romanticize the past,
Yeah, okay.
because not only was politics in the 19th century in this country pretty bad and pretty dirty, but I walked into a state legislature in Massachusetts in 1962, which had to be, I mean, as a state, one of the 3 or 4 most corrupt states in the country.
Yeah.
And much of what we did, I and my colleagues, Republicans and Democrats alike, in the 60s, was to work our heads off to change, modernize, organize, pass tough conflict of interest laws. I mean, I could go on and on and on. Not only to clean that up, but to give the state a government which stood for something when it came to integrity. And it isn't that occasionally we don't have those kinds of issues, but government these days in the United States, at least until this guy got elected, has been infinitely cleaner than it was way back. I mean, and not so way back. And I'm talking now about the 1960s in Massachusetts, but it's not just there. So we have done a lot.
Yeah, well,
With respect to law and
a lot of people think of as the norms really are post Watergate.
right, exactly. A big factor in all of this. Now, what's happened under Trump has really been outrageous in my judgment. I mean, this guy's the most corrupt president in American history. Nobody else is even close. And I include the 19th century when I say that. And one of the things that a Biden administration, if it's elected, should be doing, and I'm sure they're thinking about already, is cleaning up that mess and restoring focus to the issue of integrity generally in government, which has in fact been happening over the past several decades in an impressive way. But what we've been seeing under this president is unprecedented. I mean, I just look at this and I say, I mean, this couldn't be happening. I mean, what's going on here? You know, blatant disregard of standards, ethics, and one of the interesting things we better be looking at is what happens if he does lose and then is open to prosecution for a lot of the stuff that he's done in the past and is doing right now. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Mm-hmm. True. I mentioned in my introduction that you wrote a book with former Senator Simon called "How to Get into Politics and Why." These are 2 questions that I hear a lot from students. And so we've got a big audience of students with us now. So I thought I'd give you the opportunity to at least partially answer those 2 questions. How do you get into politics and why?
Well, the first thing you do is get into politics by getting into politics. And one of the strengths of this country is that one can do that without having to ask for a ticket of admission or kiss somebody's ring or know the political boss in order to make it. Vast majority of us, I'm an example, but by no means the only one, just kind of get into it. Bring people together, go to work, and begin to try to make things happen. And I want young people, and I'm sure you do this and I do it in my teaching, I want young people to understand just how open the system is to that kind of activism. It's really remarkable. But it also requires active participation on the part of a lot of folks, organizational skills, consensus building skills. It took me a long time to figure out, and by the way, a very painful defeat for re-election as governor the first time around, to realize that listening is an important part of governing. I was a pretty good talker. I wasn't a very good listener. And you learn two things. First, that listening is less tiring than talking. And secondly, you learn a lot by listening. And what happened in my case was that after that defeat and then my election again, I not only became a much better listener, I began just routinely putting together working groups, as I called them, every time we went down the policy road, without exception. What's a working group? A group of 20, 25, 30 people, many of whom were not supporters of mine, but all of whom cared about the particular policy issue that we were dealing with. And what I discovered, what you discover is that first, the vast majority of Americans want to solve problems. If the governor, the mayor, or the president say, hey, I need you, I want you to be a part of this. Well, I didn't support you, so don't worry about that. I want you to be involved because you have been involved in the issue. I never remember anybody saying, screw you, governor, I'm not interested.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that the governor had asked them to participate made a difference. And secondly, with some rare exceptions, vast majority, I mean, take the healthcare issue, for example. Is there anybody in America that doesn't believe that working Americans and their families should have decent, affordable health care? Because they're the ones that don't get it, you know.
Yes.
I mean, we're fine when it comes to the elderly. I mean, nothing like Medicare, let me tell you. Kitty and I have been on it for many years. But the vast majority of Americans, you go and take a poll and say, should working Americans and their families have decent, affordable health care? 93% say yes. Well, if you begin with that amount of general agreement, then it shouldn't be that difficult to come to some conclusions about how to do it. And I found, I mean, it got to the point where we always would put together a working group. And with rare exceptions, we're able to get a lot of things done and done well because we brought people together. And my advice to Joe Biden or anyone who is fortunate enough to get into a position of responsibility at whatever level, local, state, national, is use working groups, bring people together. You'll be surprised at how strongly they will respond and how active they will become in attempting to work with you to find answers to problems. It really makes a difference.
Well, we've got an anxious audience. They're pounding their desk with their shoes, just champing at the bit, wanting to ask questions. So let's turn to the audience questions. Brendan asks, do you think a potential Biden administration can get meaningful work done without getting rid of the filibuster?
I know I'm talking to a guy who thinks there's some value in filibuster. Yeah, I think you can make progress. As you know, I'm not sure I agree with you on this, but we get things done even with a filibuster. And I think you would argue that in some ways,
because of
it makes the legislature, it makes the policy making better.
That's right.
By forcing people to come together.
Right.
And there's some truth to that. But so I don't want people to quit because we have the filibuster. I don't think that's necessary. It does force folks on all sides of an issue to come together. But we've had lots of administrations that have done great things with the filibuster. We've had administrations done without them. I think there will be, we'll see, Rich, but I think there will be. And by the way, you personally can be extremely helpful in this. But I think we'll see a real, if Biden is elected, we'll see a real effort made to get off this terrible kind of mess we're in, and to get going and deal with these problems, which God knows need solution. And I think that will go a long way toward.
And I think he has his history says that he's as capable as anyone of working across the aisle.
No question.
Including a very good working relationship with Mitch McConnell.
That's interesting.
Difficult as that is to imagine. Avinash asks, could the governor please comment on his famous turkey soup recipe and its legacy?
I probably ought to, make up copies of this. It's really very simple. Take the carcass of the turkey, stick it in a pot, simmer it for 3.5 hours. Take everything you got in the refrigerator that's sitting around left over that will help make a soup a good thing. Toss it in, simmer it for another half an hour. Lots of salt and pepper, and you'll have yourself a great soup.
Right.
And if our correspondent wants the recipe, I'll be happy to send it to him. Just have him m.dukakis at northeastern.edu. But it really is not that difficult.
Well, you're making me hungry. Valmore asks, what is your opinion on the Amy Coney Barrett confirmation? How do we address the stark partisanship on the courts? And I think you've gone a long way towards answering that already.
Yeah. Well, it's distressing, I must say. I mean, to see a Supreme Court seat, I don't care who it is, kind of become a political plaything on the eve of a very, very important election it's pretty distressing. I don't know what kind of a judge she will be. I wasn't impressed with her testimony, to tell you the truth. It seemed to me to be largely designed to say nothing about anything. But who knows? Maybe we'll discover that she's a great judge. We'll see.
I mean, the blatant hypocrisy of taking that confirmation up with, in a period when people were already voting, only a couple of years after having, laid that down as the ironclad rule that
you never did it.
Right? Garland, what was it, 10 months before the election day?
It's disgraceful. Just disgraceful.
Mel asks, in retrospect, if you had it to do all over again in 1988, what would you change?
I made two big mistakes. One was in spending too much time talking to people who I thought knew more than I did about how to win the presidency, all of whom poo-pooed the idea of precinct-based grassroots organization in a presidential campaign. Maybe for city council, but not for the presidency. It took Barack Obama to prove that was a big mistake. And secondly, I made a decision early on, it was a mistake, that I would not respond to the Bush attack campaign. You just can't do that. You just can't do that. I mean, if the guy's going to come after you, say on the death penalty issue, you've got to have a good, thoughtful answer. And it was there. I don't think people know this because I didn't tell them. The homicide rate in Houston, where Bush came from, which was 6 times the homicide rate in greater Houston and greater Boston, 6 times. Massachusetts did not have the death penalty. And we happen to be the state with the lowest homicide rate in America. and always have been low. Now we are the lowest state in the country. Never said that. Well, if you don't say things like that, don't be surprised if you get beaten. That was something that seems to me I should have emphasized very, very strongly, because in point of fact, the state does have the lowest homicide rate in America, and it is the safest state in America, and we should talk about it and be proud of it.
Sure.
But I didn't.
Sorry. Ratna asks, how do you see the South Carolina Senate race?
Well, I'm looking at the same polls everybody else is.
Right.
And it looks as if this Republican fellow, who we now know well, is somewhat ahead, but who knows? This is another case, and Rich, you know more about this than I do, another case where turnout may make an enormous difference. And we'll see what happens. What's interesting, however, is just how well the Democratic candidate has been doing in South Carolina, of all places.
Yes.
Which tells you what? It tells you that the South is changing. That the South is changing. And the Georgia situation is even more impressive in that way. I mean, we may get one or two Democratic senators out of the state of Georgia. And that would be pretty revolutionary, but it's been happening gradually over time. It's interesting. And I think one or maybe even two of those candidates can win those races.
You know, we saw it happen in recent years in Virginia as well. You know, a state that was really tough for Democrats, which now is pretty solidly blue.
That's right. That's right.
John asks, in the unlikely event that Trump wins, what do you think, Governor, the Democrats should and will do going forward?
We're just going to have to continue to, we can't walk away from this. We've got to continue to understand that this country is getting, if I may say, more national, with far greater diversity. And that's going to continue for indefinitely. I think it's going to happen this year. But I think what you're seeing is an increasingly diverse country in which people of color are going to be deeply and actively involved in the politics of the country and increasingly successful. And it may start in 5 days. But you can't look at what's going on in the United States these days, politically, demographically, or otherwise, and not conclude that we're going to be a different place. The former First Lady of the Commonwealth just walked into the kitchen.
Please say hello to her for me.
Hi there.
Paul asks, what do you say to Democratic voters who are passionately anti-war and are having a difficult time voting for Biden due to his vote for the Iraq War?
Well, I think he said that it was a mistake. I may be wrong. It was a mistake.
I think
but it goes far beyond this. You know, our friend Steve Kinzer has been writing a lot about this. This American tendency to begin to intervene everywhere. I don't know how many people know this, Rich, but we have well over 800, I think it's 837 or something like that, American military bases in 150 different countries. What the hell are they doing there? Why? And it's costing us an arm and a leg. I want this country to be a peacemaker, not a war maker. I understand the importance of a strong defense and all that kind of stuff. But I'm very concerned about what seems to be, what, another Cold War, this time with China? I mean, there's got to be a better way to solve international problems than going to war. And I know we've got some problems, and they've got problems with us. You know, nobody remembers this, and I don't want to sky off on stuff. The United States killed Iranian democracy in 1953. I was alive at the time. I think you probably were too. We overthrew the democratically elected government of Iran because the British didn't want the Iranians to take their oil company, and consigned the Iranian people to 27 years of one of the worst dictators in the world. Well, okay, that's what you want to do. But I think the role of the United States and of the international community generally has got to be one that emphasizes the importance of non-military forces. I'm getting soon. A few minutes. But I mean that. I want my country to be a country that brings the international community together and does what the Obama administration did with respect to nuclear arms in Iran. Extraordinary piece of diplomacy. Led, I'm proud to say, by my former lieutenant governor, John Kerry. And it was a remarkable thing. Trump gets elected, walks away from the agreement, and then imposes sanctions on the Iranians. We're the ones that broke the agreement. They didn't. And I thought it was one of the most tragic things that's happened. And I hope we can get back to an American role here, which emphasizes consensus, bringing people together, solving problems peacefully. Because if we don't do that, Rich, our planet is going to be destroyed by climate change. Mm-hmm. We haven't got time for this other stuff.
Right.
So, sorry to make a speech on this.
Oh, not at all.
I feel so strongly about this, and nobody mentions our activities back in the 1950s when it came to Iran. Nobody even mentions this. I remember. I was alive at the time. In fact, was in college at the time. And it was disgraceful, absolutely disgraceful. Enough said.
Christopher asks, what do you think of the idea of term limits on the Supreme Court? There's one reasonable sounding plan for 18-year limits with a new justice being appointed every 2 years, which would allow each presidential term to have 2 appointments.
I've already expressed my feelings on this. I'm a little concerned about screwing around with the Supreme Court. Remember, they have long terms so that they will be independent, so that they can't be influenced. Now, you can say to me, well, or our question asker can say, well, yeah, but what's happening here? These folks aren't playing politics.
Let me broaden the question a little and ask you about term limits for members of Congress.
No, I'm not for that. We had a senator who was one of the best senators we've ever had in this country, who was in Congress for over 40 years. That was Ted Kennedy. And he got better and better and better the longer he was there. Maybe it might make sense to put a cap on the number of years that a Supreme Court justice can serve. Massachusetts has one. It's a mandatory retirement age. Mm-hmm. Frankly, I think it's too short, but it's a mandatory retirement age. I mean, should we say that by age 75 or maybe 80, it's time for a Supreme Court justice to step down? That, I think, ought to be looked at pretty seriously. but I'm very concerned about some of the other proposals that we've been hearing.
Yeah, in terms, I agree with you about term limits. As someone, as you know, I spent 34 years on Capitol Hill. And what I know as a longtime staffer is that if you term limit the members, then what you wind up is an institution run by staff.
Right, right. So I think there may be a place for some balance here in terms of how long you can stay. But and of course, we're all, you know, we think at least that we're all living longer and living better. But maybe what we do here makes some sense in terms of some kind of a cap on length of service.
Frederick asks, how concerned are you that we will witness significant unprecedented civil unrest after November 3rd?
I don't think it will happen. I think in this case, even Republicans will be opposed to this kind of thing. And obviously, as we've already said, a decisive victory on election night or soon thereafter will go a long way toward dealing with that. But I think there's enough institutional support on both sides for observing what in fact does happen. And I think there would be a huge reaction to any attempt by Trump and his allies to play around with that. But as we said, best way to do it is a decisive result, one way or the other.
I think you do have to say that we're probably closer to that line than we have been
for some time.
Right.
No question.
Gordon asked, throughout your campaign in 1988, you were consistently attacked as a Massachusetts liberal. And throughout recent Democratic primaries, certain candidates have been called too liberal or progressive for the general electorate. Do you think that it's electorally dangerous for the Democratic Party to continue to move to the left, or do you think the progressive movement can become widely accepted?
This may sound strange, but I don't see this move to the left. I mean, take, for example, the healthcare issue. The first serious presidential candidate to propose universal health care was a guy named Theodore Roosevelt.
Yes.
In the campaign of, when was it? 1912.
Yeah.
Calvin Coolidge, as a candidate for lieutenant governor in 1916 in Massachusetts, proposed universal health insurance for the people of Massachusetts. Coolidge. And it was part of the progressive movement at the time. And we're still debating the thing.
Well, in reality, Richard Nixon put a plan on the table that was really
close.
Fairness, you know, to the left of Obamacare.
Right, right. Now, if we want a private option as part of this, that's fine. I think the vast majority of people will migrate very quickly to universal Medicare. Because for those of us who get Medicare, I mean, the system is so much more efficient and so much more satisfactory from a consumer standpoint that I don't think you'd see a lot of folks sticking with what, unfortunately, and I'm not saying this to beat up on the private insurance companies, but private insurance is a mess and very expensive. Private health insurance takes somewhere between 20 and 25% of the total premium for overhead. The comparable figure for Medicare is 3%, maybe 2%. You mean the government is more efficient than the private sector? In this case, the answer is yes, because it's a universal system, has a set of standard rules. You don't have 175 different plans. They're driving everybody crazy. And it's the preferred model for most countries. In fact, when Taiwan, of all places, interesting, decided that they were going to put together a comprehensive plan for universal insurance, they went all over the country. They asked somebody from Massachusetts to head up their task force, who was a wonderful guy. And they went out and came back and said, universal Medicare, basically. And that's what they have. And it is effective, efficient, and far less expensive than private insurance. So is that socialism? What are you talking about?
That's right.
But that was what a lot of folks were calling Medicare. Now try to repeal it.
Right.
Right?
Exactly.
Not a chance. So this notion that we're going left, what does that mean? I mean, providing more generous assistance for kids so they can go to college, that's going left. I think it's doing the right thing. I don't see this as a left or right thing. You know, a decent minimum wage. Minimum wage in this country began under Roosevelt. So I don't see this ideological stuff.
Yeah.
I see a country that is looking, I hope, to eliminate inequities, provide everybody, especially working folks, with decent income, health care, and making it possible for our kids to go to school without going bankrupt. If that's going left, then I don't understand.
Right.
I don't understand the term. It just seems to be it's part of a good, solid, progressive, in the best sense of the word, tradition, which will make this a better country and provide real opportunity for millions of Americans, especially young Americans.
So you think that the notion that there's a huge division, a rift in the Democratic Party is overblown?
There's a division, but so that's life. I mean,
Right.
if we end up under Biden with a public option, as I've said, I think you'll see a lot of folks electing it. Maybe some folks will stick with the private system, but by and large, I think you'll see people moving toward public coverage, if you will. But there's nothing new about that.
Mm.
To repeat, 65 million of us currently have Medicare.
Mm.
And we wouldn't part with it for the,
That's right.
the world.
That's right. In fact, it's a good part of the explanation why older people vote more reliably than younger people, because they have that, immediate interest right there all the time, that they want to protect that Social Security and that Medicare.
And it's good for them, and it's good for people who are 55 or 53 or 48 or whatever. And I hope we're going to get it.
Paul asks, you mentioned the possibility of a post-presidential prosecution of Trump for his crimes. How can we justify that when we didn't push for the prosecution of George W. Bush for an illegal war and for torture?
Look, these are tough issues. Do you prosecute somebody because in the exercise of his authority, he decided to go to war? That's a little different from prosecuting somebody for outrageous tax evasion, for fraud, for a whole series of things. and I don't think I'm splitting hairs here. From everything we know, Trump is engaged in criminal activity. Real, no question, criminal activity. You ought to be prosecuted for it. Should somebody be prosecuted for going to war? I think that's a tougher one to justify, no matter how much I or the questioner may think that invading Iraq was a terrible mistake, as it was. As it was.
So Christopher asks, from one train guy to another, would Governor Dukakis have any advice to a President Biden for improving America's long-distance, regional, and local transit?
The answer is an emphatic yes. And let me tell you something, there's nobody better than Joe Biden when it comes to leading the way to a first-class national passenger rail system. This is the guy who rode Amtrak every night to go home to his wife and kids. And at one point, without a wife. And I'm delighted. I mean, if he gets elected, I think our chances of finally doing that, where the rest of the world is going right by us, Rich, when it comes to transportation and infrastructure. It's pathetic. Absolutely pathetic.
Let me just add there as a further explanation of that question for the audience that doesn't know. Governor Dukakis was famous as governor for traveling back and forth to the State House on the MBTA, the trolley system in Boston.
But believe me, it wasn't an act. I've been doing it all my life. And there's a lot to be said for governors riding the T or its equivalent. I learned more on the T from talking to and listening to my fellow commuters. And it wasn't anything that was new with me. I mean, I've been doing it all my life. And it did make a difference, I think, that the governor was on the T.
I think that makes a fitting last word for our conversation. Governor, I want to thank you so much for being so generous with your time. I know if we could see and hear the audience, there's a standing ovation going on right now. We don't get those on Zoom. But thanks again, and hope to see you soon.
Let's see what happens on Tuesday.
Right.
Thanks so much, Rich.
Happy birthday.
Maybe I can come down to Brown at some point after we finally get a vaccine.
We'd love to do it in person. Absolutely.
That'd be great.
Bye-bye.
You bet.